Mask. If she died or lost power before that equipment was used, and Tutankhamun then died unexpectedly young with his own burial goods incomplete, court officials facing that 70-day deadline could have adapted her mask, plugging the ear piercings, replacing the face, and recarving the name, rather than building an entirely new one from nothing. That's a coherent theory. It is not a proven one. In August 2015, the mask made headlines for an entirely different reason. During routine handling at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, its ceremonial braided beard, a separate piece attached to the chin, was knocked loose and broke off. In the initial panic, museum staff reattached it using a fast-drying epoxy adhesive, leaving visible smears of glue around the chin. The repair job was clumsy enough that it made international news, and 8 museum staff were eventually referred to a disciplinary hearing over the incident. Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities brought in Christian Ekman, a German conservator with long experience in ancient metalwork, to properly remove the epoxy and reattach the beard using techniques closer to what the original craftsman would have used, such as a reversible adhesive. While the mask was off display and accessible for close study, Ekman's team also carried out an X-ray fluorescence, or XRF, analysis of the piece, a genuine, non-destructive technique that reads the elemental composition of metal at a given point without damaging it. This is where the science actually got interesting, and where the real story diverges hardest from the shocking discovery version. Ekman's team did not find evidence supporting the swap face theory. Reporting at the time and since has been consistent on this point. The conservators' remote sensing work turned up no trace of the face having been separately attached or of a different royal name lying beneath the current inscription. In other words, one of the 2 research teams that got hands-on access to the mask around 2015 looked specifically for evidence of a reused, reworked face, and came back with a negative result. That should have settled the matter. It didn't. Reeves' 2015 argument didn't stop at the mask. He also proposed something much bigger, that the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb concealed sealed doorways leading to further chambers, and that one of those chambers might be the long-lost burial place of Nefertiti herself. The idea was that Tutankhamun's small, awkwardly laid-out tomb was originally built as an antechamber to a larger royal burial, and that his own burial had simply been squeezed into part of a space intended for someone else. Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities took the claim seriously enough to commission scans. In late 2015, Japanese radar specialist Hirokatsu Watanabe conducted ground-penetrating radar work inside the tomb and reported signs consistent with voids and even organic and metallic material behind the walls, which briefly led officials to state there was a high probability of hidden chambers. A second independent round of scanning followed in 2016, led by Francesco Porcelli and a team from the Polytechnic University of Turin, using different radar equipment. Their results did not confirm Watanabe's findings. Then, in 2018, a further set of scans conducted with the National Geographic Society, involving geophysicist Dean Goodman, concluded flatly that there was no evidence of hidden chambers behind the tomb's walls at all. So on the secret chamber side of Reeves' theory, the best current evidence says no, there doesn't appear to be a hidden room. That doesn't disprove the mask theory on its own, since the 2 claims are separable. But it does mean the more dramatic version of the story, the one involving a literal undiscovered tomb of Nefertiti sitting behind a wall, has not held up under actual remote sensing scrutiny. The story might have ended there, quietly filed under interesting theory, not confirmed. Instead, it resurfaced in 2024 with new momentum, driven by a team at the University of York led by Egyptologist Joanne Fletcher. Fletcher and her colleagues went back to something almost nobody had looked at closely in decades: the original excavation records and photographs from Carter's 1920s dig, now archived at Oxford's Griffith Institute. Working from those primary records rather than the mask itself, the team re-examined the documented pierced ears and reportedly identified further physical details supporting the reuse theory. Differences in gold purity between the face and the rest of the mask, and what they described as visible evidence of soldering around the face, as though it had been fitted onto an existing headdress rather than cast as one piece. Site index equals 6-1. Fletcher stated that evidence of soldering is clearly visible on the mask, as if Tutankhamun's own face had effectively been grafted onto the mask of the previous ruler, and that the original owner may have had pierced ears and may have been a woman, possibly Nefertiti/site. That reporting made global headlines again in November 2024, largely echoing. Picture the most photographed object in the history of archaeology. 22 pounds of solid gold, inlaid with lapis lazuli and turquoise, its eyes rimmed in obsidian and quartz. For a century, it has been the face of ancient Egypt itself. Printed on postcards, stamped on coffee mugs, stared at by millions of visitors a year. But a growing number of Egyptologists now believe that face may not belong to the boy king at all. Not because of some secret scanner smuggled into a museum after hours. Because of pierced ears, mismatched gold, solder lines under a microscope, and a debate that has split the field of Egyptology for almost a decade. A debate that is still, as of today, unresolved. This is the real story of the argument over Tutankhamun's mask. No invented technology. No fictional scientists. Just what the evidence actually shows, and why nobody can agree on what it means. November 1922. British archaeologist Howard Carter chisels a small opening into a sealed doorway deep in the Valley of the Kings. He holds a candle up to the gap. Behind him, his patron Lord Carnarvon asks if he can see anything. Carter's reply became one of the most quoted lines in archaeology. Yes, wonderful things. What Carter had found was the almost intact tomb of a minor 18th dynasty pharaoh named Tutankhamun, who took the throne as a child and died around age 18 or 19. Nested inside 3 coffins, the innermost made of solid gold, lay his mummy, and over its head and shoulders sat the mask that would eventually become the single most recognizable artifact from the ancient world. The tomb itself is small and cramped compared to other royal burials in the valley, and some of its wall paintings look rushed. Tutankhamun's death appears to have come without much warning. Modern research on his mummy has pointed to a combination of malaria and complications from a broken leg, and possibly congenital conditions linked to his parents being close relatives. Egyptian funerary custom required burial within roughly 70 days of death, which is not a lot of time to assemble a full royal burial from scratch. Historians have long accepted that some of what went into Tutankhamun's tomb was likely repurposed from existing stock rather than custom built for him. That backdrop matters because it's the foundation for everything that follows. For decades, nobody paid much attention to one small detail on the mask. Its earlobes are pierced, with the holes even fitted with gold plugs or bosses, to keep the pierced holes visibly bare in the finished piece. In ancient Egyptian royal art, pierced ears show up constantly on children and on queens. They essentially never show up on the official mature image of a reigning king. Depictions of Tutankhamun as a child do show pierced ears, but adult royal imagery of him typically doesn't, which is part of what makes the mask's ears stand out. The Egyptologist who pushed this observation into the spotlight was Nicholas Reeves, a British archaeologist who has spent much of his career studying the Amarna period, the unusual stretch of Egyptian history when Tutankhamun's father, Akhenaten, tried to remake Egyptian religion around a single sun god. In 2015, Reeves argued publicly that the mask's face and the rest of the headdress showed different gold work and coloring, and that the earlobes pointed to an original owner who was not an adult king at all, quite possibly Nefertiti, Akhenaten's chief wife and Tutankhamun's stepmother. Site index equals 18-1. Reeves examined the back of Tutankhamun's death mask and noticed that the type of gold and the material used for the blue color differ between the front and the back. Site. Reeves went further than the ears. Looking closely at the cartouche, the oval that encloses a royal name, on the mask, he believed he could see faint traces of an earlier inscription beneath Tutankhamun's name, as if the surface had been reworked. He proposed that the original name might correspond to Enkhepurur Nefertiti, one of the throne names historians associate with the period just after Akhenaten's death, a period many scholars now think Nefertiti ruled in her own right before Tutankhamun took the throne. Reeves published this argument formally in a 2015 paper for the Bulletin of the Egyptological Seminar, and it also circulated in Egyptian press coverage that year. Nefertiti herself is one of Egyptology's great open questions. She's world famous from her painted limestone bust in Berlin, but her tomb has never been conclusively identified, and no mummy has been confirmed as hers. Many scholars accept that after Akhenaten's death, someone using the throne name Nefertiti ruled Egypt, and a substantial number of them think that ruler was Nefertiti herself, reigning as a female pharaoh before her stepson Tutankhamun came to power as a child. If Reeves was right, the logic would run something like this. Nefertiti, as a ruling pharaoh, would have had her own royal funerary equipment prepared, including a Reeves' original 2015 case, but adding the archival photographic angle. But it's worth being clear about what this actually is. A rereading of old excavation documentation and renewed argument by a specific research team, not a new laboratory scan of the physical mask itself, and not a peer-reviewed bombshell overturning Ekman's earlier XRF findings. Other Egyptologists have pushed back, and not just on procedural grounds. Some point out that pierced ears alone prove less than headlines suggest. Mummies of several New Kingdom kings, Tutankhamun's own included, show pierced earlobes, and some argue that royal children of both sexes were routinely depicted with piercings before rejecting or retaining them as they aged, muddying the idea that pierced ears are an exclusively female marker on a golden mask. A different, more measured version of the reuse argument comes from Aidan Dodson, an Egyptologist and specialist in the Amarna period. Dodson doesn't dismiss the idea that the mask incorporates material intended for the ruler known as Nefertiti, widely believed to be Nefertiti reigning in her own right, but he frames it differently than a last-minute, 70-day scramble. His view is that Nefertiti's funerary equipment was likely repurposed for Tutankhamun early in his own reign, well before his death, meaning his burial goods were largely finished and simply reused, rather than a mask being torn from someone else's tomb the week he died. He also notes that reusing coffins and burial equipment between royals was not unusual for this period of Egyptian history. So evidence of reuse doesn't automatically imply a cover-up or scandal. It may just reflect ordinary royal practice. Site index equals 9-1. Dodson argues that Nefertiti never received a proper kingly burial, so her material was likely repurposed for Tutankhamun very early in his reign, meaning his burial equipment was already essentially finished rather than assembled in a hurry, and that reuse of tomb equipment, including coffins and burial vaults, was common in this period. Site. Strip away the theatrics. And here is what can honestly be said about Tutankhamun's mask in 2026. The mask's earlobes are pierced and fitted with decorative plugs. That is an observable, uncontested physical feature. Pierced ears are far more commonly associated with royal women and children in Egyptian art than with adult reigning kings, though the pattern is not absolute. At least one hands-on scientific investigation, Christian Ekman's XRF work around 2015 to 2016, did not find evidence that the face had been separately attached to a different, older headdress. That result has never been retracted or formally overturned in a peer-reviewed venue. Separately, other researchers, including Nicholas Reeves and later Joan Fletcher's team, argue from visual and archival evidence, gold color differences, apparent solder lines, and what they read as an erased inscription beneath Tutankhamun's cartouche, that the mask, or at least significant elements of it, originated with a different, likely female ruler. The proposed hidden chamber that once accompanied this theory, potentially containing Nefertiti's tomb, has been searched for with 2 separate rounds of independent ground-penetrating radar, and neither has found convincing evidence that it exists. No consensus has formed. Egyptology, as a field, is still arguing about this, and the two sides aren't disagreeing about facts nobody can check. They're disagreeing about how to interpret gold color variants, what counts as solder versus casting artifact, and how much weight faint marks on decades-old photographs can bear. That is a live scientific and scholarly dispute, not a settled cover-up. It's worth asking why this argument keeps resurfacing decade after decade instead of getting resolved. Part of the answer is practical. The mask is one of the most valuable and fragile objects on Earth, and there's understandable institutional caution about subjecting it to more invasive testing. Non-destructive methods, like XRF, can only tell you so much. They're good at reading surface composition, but limited in reconstructing manufacturing history with certainty. Part of the answer is also that this isn't really a story about one mask. It's a proxy fight over a much bigger and genuinely unresolved question in Egyptology. What actually happened in Egypt in the chaotic years after Akhenaten's religious revolution collapsed? Who ruled between Akhenaten and Tutankhamun? Was Nefertiti a separate person, or was it Nefertiti under a new name? Did Nefertiti's reign end in a natural transfer of power to her stepson, or something messier? Every scrap of physical evidence from that transition, a mask, a coffin, a heifer,